going back to observational studies, are there any things that you look for in particular that will increase or decrease your confidence in it, whether it's a pearl necklace or garbage?
Selection bias is a big one. So I think when I think about observational studies, whether they be prospective or retrospective, the healthy user bias, I think, is one of the more common ones we see in the epidemiology as it pertains to health. So I wouldn't even know where to begin talking about these studies because the examples are so myriad. But, is bacon bad for you? Well, if you look at observational epidemiology, bacon is almost always bad for you. I don't know what the hazard ratios are, Bob, but it's probably in the neighborhood of 1.3 or something like that, meaning it has about a 30% increase in the risk of basically anything you look at, right? Whether it be cancer, heart disease, death. Is that directionally right?
I think that's right. I mean, there's probably more nuance because it's the WHO is looking at, I think they said over 700 epidemiological studies for red meat consumption. And I think they also had processed meat consumption. Mm-hmm. When you look at those, we can get into it, but how are they measuring bacon consumption? They're using these food frequency questionnaires, probably get into this recall bias. But yeah, generally, I think with the WHO stuff, I think it was about 20 to 30% associated increase.
Yeah. And so you look at that on the surface, of course you'd be concerned. You'd be like, oh my God, like I shouldn't be eating fill in the blank. I shouldn't be drinking coffee. I shouldn't be eating bacon. I shouldn't be eating meat at all. The problem with these studies is that you can't ever, no matter how much you try to statistically reconcile it, you can't strip out the fact that people make choices not in isolation. So is there any difference between a person who makes a lifelong decision to not eat meat and a person who doesn't? Of course there is. And it's going to come down to many things that go beyond their diet, including things that can't be controlled for. Now, obviously you can control for some things. Smoking. A person who doesn't eat meat is far less likely to smoke than a person who does. A person who doesn't eat meat is probably far more likely to exercise or pay attention to their sleep habits or be more compliant with their medications or things like that. Again, not that people who don't eat meat don't care about those things, but people who don't eat meat, not the people who eat meat don't care about those things. People who don't eat meat, basically that is a proxy. That is a really good marker for someone who is very, very health conscious. So this healthy user bias permeates everywhere. And by the way, it permeates in both directions. So if you look at the epidemiology that started to become very popular about 10 years ago, that was suggesting that diet soda was more fattening than soda, right? So drinking a Diet Coke is worse than drinking a Coke. Well, on the surface, that doesn't seem to make a lot of sense, right? I mean, Diet Coke has no calories in it. Coke is full of just liquid sugar. And of course, that gets you thinking, is it the aspartame or whatever else? Well, I mean, a far simpler explanation is look at people who are drinking diet soda versus people who are drinking soda. You could make an argument, and I think this is the argument, that as a person is becoming more metabolically ill and they're being informed that they really need to stop drinking soda, they're going to be drinking diet soda. And so it's very difficult to look at just people drink this, people drink that. They're otherwise identical, and simply the only difference between them is what they drink. It just doesn't really hold up. So anyway, you're always going to look for that sort of healthy user bias. You talked about another bias a second ago, which is informational recall bias. And I think many people are just shocked to learn how clunky and kludgy nutritional epidemiology is. I mean, it's like when you think about all of the amazing technology we have in the world, and you look at, we just recently did a podcast and talking about some of the most cutting edge tools of neuroscience that allow you to examine the behavior of a single neuron using channel opsins and all these things. Like, that's at one end of science. And at the other end of science, we have this thing called a food frequency questionnaire, where you get a call from Billy, and he asks you, hey, do you remember how many times a week you ate oatmeal for the past year? I mean, I pay quite a bit of attention to what I eat. I don't know how I'd answer that question.
You just go to your spreadsheet of your oatmeal consumption, right?
Yeah. Now you've dug into this a bit, Bob. Can you? I'm being a bit tongue-in-cheek and facetious. Can you try to make the case that recall bias isn't really that bad, and I'm just exaggerating?
I can't make that case. I guess it might depend on what are you recalling.
Okay. What's
so
the
are you recalling
best?
your
What's the
smoking
best
history?
case?
Let's
Yeah.
say,
What's the best
Compared to
case
food.
scenario?
Best case scenario. Well, maybe so. I would probably get out of the food category. It might have to do with something, say, like smoking history, and you might even have receipts of the last time that you paid for cigarettes or something like that. That if you ask people how much did you smoke in the last year, I think you can get a more accurate answer. But with the food frequency questionnaires, there's so many analyses, but even just the number of foods that are out there compared to the number of foods that are encapsulated in the food frequency questionnaire, vastly different. It only covers a very small portion of it, and it's actually the foods that I think the epidemiologists often look at, like the red meat consumption and things like that people will vastly they will underestimate. It's when they do like these validity studies and actually follow them, or they do like a food log compared to their food frequency, compared to the food frequency questionnaires, it's the correlation is so low that it's so underestimated that you're not really getting an accurate picture. So I don't know about like a best case scenario with food frequency questionnaires for food. I guess it would be on frequency. Imagine if you got a food frequency questionnaire that was maybe more technologically advanced, where you got like it's an app where you literally recall at the end of each day, what did I eat today? Or even after each meal. But the problem is the frequency of this, that oftentimes you're doing one questionnaire for what did you eat over the course of, say, 1 year or 2 years, or even they'll just do one food frequency questionnaire at the beginning of the study at baseline. They'll follow up with these people for say 10 years, 20 years. And the assumption is they don't change their eating habits. They never ask them again, what happened here. But if they look at, they might compare two groups. One group has higher bacon consumption than the other. The assumption is that they're going to continue with those dietary habits for, in perpetuity. So again, that's not a best case scenario. But I guess the best case scenario is you could have more rigor, I think, if you did it more frequently, because obviously I think, if I asked you what you had for breakfast this morning, I think you probably have more confidence in the answer than what did you have for breakfast on January 3rd of last year.
Yeah, I think with nutrition, because I spend so much time doing this type of stuff with patients, it's metaphysically impossible. And I really feel strongly that we should abandon food frequency questionnaires, and no study should ever be published that includes them. I'm going to anger a number of epidemiologists listening to this, but I really think we need to put a stop to that. I think where recall is reasonable is, as you said, on things that are more profound. If we wanted to do a study on think of something really that you would never forget, like, childbirth, like asking women to recall, how many times have you been pregnant? How many times did you either have an abortion or miscarry? And how many times did you deliver at term? Like something that profound. Yeah, I would feel confident that if you asked a woman that question over the past 10 years of her life, you would get very accurate answers. But by the way, it still doesn't tell me that I would be able to infer causality. If I was trying to look at women who have, never had a miscarriage versus women who have had miscarriages, just because I look back and ask them to tell me those things doesn't mean that embedded within those differences are other biological or social or economic factors. So you kind of get where we're going here, which is, I think epidemiology has a place, but I think it's the pendulum has sort of swung a little too far, and its place has been asserted as being more valuable than I think it probably is. You kind of talked about something that's, I think, a very important bias that exists in any study, but I think this is actually a big problem in experimental studies, in prospective studies if they're done incorrectly, which is something called performance bias. So the Hawthorne effect is basically an effect that says if a person is watching you, you will change your behavior. So anybody who has tried to fastidiously log what they eat every day, which I've done many people have done this, there's no question you change your behavior. Just by logging what you eat, you will change what you eat. How much more will you do it when you know someone is going to look at it? Unbelievably so. In fact, you could make a case that one of the most efficacious dietary interventions known to man is having somebody watch what you eat every meal. Not just every meal, every moment. And whether you have somebody virtually or literally watching you at every moment eat, especially someone who, you're not entirely comfortable with, that's going to have an enormous impact. I think isn't there a name for this that's like a car? It's like, is it the Hertz effect?
Yes, it's the Avis effect, because actually I think Hertz in the 70s and 80s, Avis was always behind.
Oh, they were behind
was
Hertz.
It budget?
Yeah,
it was either Hertz or budget rent-a-car. So their slogan, I thought it was great, kind of cool, interesting. Basically, we're number two, and then they would say we try harder because we've got this inferiority complex. We're number two, and that I'm trying to think of an example, because the Hawthorne effect is, it's almost like a experimenter bias, that the experimenter is observing the people under the lamp. That was where this came from. And looked at work productivity with different lighting. And they got the clipboard, and it could be your boss that's out there and looking and watching you. And so that experimenter is having the effect. With the Avis effect, I think it's more trying to think of an example. So say you, Peter, competitive Peter, were enrolled in a cycling trial, and you realize, say it's open label, and you get a placebo, or you get nothing. And you know that there's another group out there that say, I think we looked at this a little bit, say it's like this lotion that you put on, and supposedly it's supposed to improve your performance. There could be a part of you that says, I'm going to beat those guys. The control group, they're going to say, we're number two, we're not getting the special treatment. So we're going to win this thing. It sounds like that wouldn't happen, but I think that people, if they enroll in a trial, sometimes there's that competitive nature. And it's also to your point about if you have somebody watching you, that could also adjust your performance. Now you have this, whether it's not physically somebody watching you, but that there's a trial that's following you, and that that they're going to be looking, a year down the road, 2 years down the road, or even 3 weeks down the road is probably more common, and they're gonna test you again and see how you do, and see if you improve or see if you don't. Those things can play a role. And just to the point of somebody that might be not pleasant that's watching you as far as food, there's a great Saturday Night Live clip it's The Rock in the clip, and it's a commercial it's called Nicotrel, and it's a smoking cessation treatment. And it's actually, The Rock is named Nick Cottrell, and there's a guy on a couch, and he's about to smoke a cigarette, and The Rock comes out jacked, smacks the cigarette out of his hand, and it's one of the most effective smoking cessation programs I've seen.
I bet. I think there's a more sinister form of performance bias that creeps up in clinical trials, especially in randomized control trials, where you think at the surface, wow, this is a really well done study. So you'll take two groups, and let's say it's a weight loss trial, and we're going to test calorie restriction versus pick your diet, your favorite, the all potato diet. So the calorie restricted group is given some leaflets, and it tells them how to measure calories, and that they need to cut their calories by 25% from baseline, and we'll see you in 12 weeks. The potato diet group is given twice weekly counseling sessions on all the different ways you can cook potatoes so that you don't get, fed up and bored of eating potatoes all day on the potato diet group. And at the end of the study, the potato diet group lost more weight than the calorie restricted group. Well, it'd be tempting to say, well, come on, this was a randomized control trial. I mean, but the problem is there's an enormous performance bias in the potato group, in that they were given far more attention, they were observed more, they were given more coaching, they had much more of a positive behavioral influence. And I would say that's the number one bias that I see in RCTs that are lifestyle based, is that very sort of subtle performance bias. So if you're really designing a trial well, you have to flatten the curve on those differences. So each person in each group should be getting the exact same amount of attention, the exact same amount of touch with the investigators, the exact same type of advice, so that you can sort of eliminate that difference, which unfortunately shows up a lot.
Yeah, I think that almost gets back to this idea of the null hypothesis that what do you say, coffee might darken your eyes, and that's your guess. Maybe you've observed it. You've got a couple of case studies of some people in your family or whatever, and so that's your hypothesis. And then the way that you design the trial is interesting because it's really like this coffee is going to be innocent until proven guilty. That's going to be the default position, and then it's really your role, and it seems almost counterintuitive to a lot of people, and it's hard actually from a human perspective, is that your role is really to be as rigorous as possible to essentially falsify your hypothesis. You need to do that, as rigorously as you can. And sometimes, I think to your point, sometimes it's like you get really excited about a treatment. The people that are involved in the study, the investigators, they're really excited about it. And the control group or the placebo, it's almost an afterthought. And so there might be a lot of things that they're doing in the treatment group, not just the treatment itself, that could bias the study.
Yeah. So kind of continuing on that thread of other things that you want to look at in a study is, and we talked about this very briefly in passing, was the idea of differentiating primary from secondary outcomes. So, and there's some debate about whether you can only have one primary outcome or whether you can have co-primary outcomes. But the primary outcomes are basically the outcomes for which the study is designed around and powered against. Again, we will come to this idea of power in a moment. But there are lots of secondary outcomes, and they're often exploratory. So it's really important that when people are pre-registering studies, they state what the primary outcome is and what the secondary outcomes are. And typically, a study that fails to meet its primary outcome will be deemed a null study, even if it meets secondary outcomes. So it's just very important to pay attention to the subtlety of that. And again, a good journal with a pre-registered study is going to make that abundantly clear. But I can promise you that someone writing about it in the newspaper is virtually never going to make that distinction. And it's important to understand that because it gets to this next issue, which is kind of the multiple hypothesis testing problem. So, research should be hypothesis seeking or hypothesis testing, but it can also be hypothesis generating. And so you can use statistical tools to slice and dice data in multiple ways, and you can take many looks at data to see if you actually find something significant there. You have to be careful because the more you look, the more times you look at something, the more likely you are to find something that is indeed positive. So, this isn't a great analogy, but just to kind of give you a sense of it, if you flip a coin and it's a fair coin, you've got like a 50% chance of getting heads. If you get two chances to flip the coin, the probability that you're going to get heads is now 75%. If you get three chances to flip a coin, you're up to 87.5% chance that you're going to get at least one head. If you flip this thing 10 times, you're basically at 100% likely that you're going to get heads. So if you're allowed 10 looks, you have to correct for that. And there's something in statistics called a Bonferroni correction factor that does force you to do that. It forces you to divide your p-value by n, where n is the number of times you've taken a look at the data, so to speak. And therefore, it raises the bar for what is significant. And again, we'll talk about p-values for folks who maybe aren't as familiar with that in a second. Anything else? I'm kind of rattling off a long list of things that are one would look for. Is there anything else that you'd add to that? I'm sure I'm missing some things.
Well, I think it's maybe a more technical term that we didn't bring up, which is confounding. But that when we talked about the healthy user bias, I think that's a great example of something that can confound your results. That doesn't necessarily, it's not in the causal pathway, let's call it, that might be affecting the results, whether it's age, sex, smoking. The list is almost endless. And this is what those observational studies will try to control for, in order to almost mimic what randomization would look like.
Right. This is the sort of the bane of the existence of the epidemiologist, right? So if if you're trying to determine a relationship between hot chocolate consumption and skiing accidents, it's very likely that people who drink more hot chocolate are more likely to have ski accidents. So does skiing cause hot chocolate consumption, or do ski accidents cause hot chocolate consumption? Does consuming hot chocolate make you a worse skier? Or is it that people who live in colder climates consume more hot chocolate, and usually skiing occurs in colder climates outside of Dubai? So climate, therefore, is obviously a confounder, and the goal is to be able to identify every possible confounder when you're doing epidemiology. And I think, as John Ioannidis argued when we had him on our podcast, and that would be a good podcast for people to go back and listen to alongside this, it's really not possible to identify, let alone eliminate, all confounders.